Thank you for coming. Please be turning to Psalm 78, please. As we continue our studies in the Psalms, the section of the Psalms that we're in were not written by David, but were written by Asaph. And last week we studied Psalm 76 and 77. So let's just briefly review those Psalms. About Psalm 76, what theme did we discuss? We studied Psalm 76 last week. Someone be able to tell us the theme of Psalm 76 from last week? Frank.
The majesty of God and his judgment.
Okay, especially God is a great judge, a God who not only punishes the wicked, but delivers the oppressed, and so we should worship him and serve him. And how about Psalm 77? What was Psalm 77 about, the theme of Psalm 77? What do you recall Psalm 77? Karen?
Crying out to God when we're troubled, but remembering his works of old and how he's always kept his promises and comforted his people.
Okay. So, as many of the Psalms, the psalmist was in trouble and asking God for help, but he remembers God's works in the past, the blessings he'd given to his people and redeemed his people and so on. And so this was reason for us to trust him for our problems as well. So in Psalm 78 then, as we turn to Psalm 78, questions or discussion before we start this evening? Let's go ahead and read. It's a long psalm. We're not going to be able to finish it tonight. Hopefully we'll finish it in a couple of weeks, a couple of less sessions. But let's read the first 20 verses. We'd like to read Psalm 78, verses 1 through 20 for us, please. Psalm 78, verses 1 through 20. Bill, please.
Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and their fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come and praise the Lord, and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set in their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and they may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law, and forgot his works, and his wonders that he had shown them. Marvelous things he did in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the seas and caused them to pass through, and he made the water stand up like a heap. In the daytime also he led them with the cloud, and all the night with the light of fire. He split the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink in abundance like the depths. He also brought streams out of the rock, and caused the waters to run down like rivers. But they sinned even more against him, and rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness. And they tested God in their heart by asking for food and their fancy. Yes, they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock so that the water gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also?
Okay.
Can he provide meat for his people?
Okay. So, as we begin the psalm, question number 1, how would you summarize the theme? As you studied and prepared for the lesson tonight, what would you say was the theme of this psalm? How would you summarize it? Rick?
Israel's refusal to follow his word. Said, listen, Israel, and keep my ways of the good things I've done. Return to me and follow my ways, and do not sin as those of old days.
Okay, so you have, on the one hand, the goodness of God repeatedly through his history of it dealing with the nation of Israel, and on the other hand, their unfaithfulness. So it repeatedly talks about how good things God did to them and how they responded with disobedience rather than with obedience. Okay, other comments on the theme of the psalm? All right, so we'll look at it as we go through the psalm. We'll look at the examples that it gives, but it starts off in the first few verses. Question number 2. What did the psalmist intend to tell the people? The first 4 verses. What's he going to tell the people? The first 4 verses. Frank?
To listen to the words of God, to hear his voice, and tell to the following generations of the works of God.
Okay, so he's going to talk about, he says, dark sayings of old, but things we've heard, things we've known, our fathers have told us, and we should tell to the future generation. So in many ways, it's going to be a discussion of the past, of the history of the nation of Israel, which always interested the Israelites to hear about their history, even though sometimes they didn't seem to learn the lesson. But it's a summary of history of the nation and of their past mistakes. Okay? Other comments on the first 4 verses? And comments on the fact that he calls it a parable. Did you think why he would call it a parable? It's fairly straightforward. Historically, why did he call it a parable? A parable is a story that teaches a spiritual lesson. What sense is this going to be a parable? Did you think about that? Not like Jesus. Frank, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, story of their history.
Okay. When you think about Jesus' parables, you think about some story he tells about something physical to teach a spiritual lesson. This is not a more hypothetical story like Jesus' parables might have been. This is a real story, a real history, but it's teaching us a spiritual lesson for them and for us. So the history of itself is being used to teach a spiritual lesson that we should go by. That seems to me to be why he says he's a parable, not to imply that it's anything symbolic necessarily, but there's a lesson for us to learn from it. Okay? Other comments to verse 4? Okay, then in the next question, begin to look at some applications in verses 4 through 8. What's the lesson that he wants us to learn from this history? First of all, verses 4 through 8, what's the first thing he wants us to do? Verses 4 through 8. Terry?
He wants us to be careful to teach them to be careful to teach their children so that they will not forget the works of God, and they can put confidence in God and keep his commands. And if we do not do this, we'll be just like them. We will lose future generations if we fail.
Okay. So the emphasis as it begins is these are lessons to teach the future generations. These are not things just for us to know about, talking to the people who live through these things, but things to be taught to our children, future generations. And so he talks about the law that God commanded to the fathers, verse 5, make it known to your children. And verse 6, the children that should be born that may declare to their children, and that they may set their hope on God and not forget his works. Okay? Other comments on those verses 4 through 8? And the lessons for us? Terry?
It's pretty plain about what that, sometimes we think, just telling them the story of Joseph, or you're just telling them the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. But there was a purpose for God recording that, even for us, and if we neglect that, it's to our own peril and the peril of our children that we didn't teach them what God does and what the confidence we can have in God, and that keeping his law, that's shown over and over again how important it was to God that they kept His law. And if we fail to teach that, we don't teach them to honor God. They don't have any reason to if we don't teach them that.
Okay, so you're really getting into question 3, which is where we really need to go with this, the lessons we should learn. It's an application to us. Other comments on question 3 and the lessons we should learn here? Steve?
Trust and obedience to God's commandments.
Okay. And the example of those who didn't and what happened as a result. Okay. So God expects us to serve and obey. He expects us to be faithful. When we're not, there's consequences. And we can see that through the history of Israel. Okay, other comments? Okay. I'd like for us to think seriously about, especially the point Terry made, that, when we're kids, if we grew up attending services with God's people, we studied the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and then into Moses and their stories. And it's good for the young people to know their stories. But as we grow older, it's very important for us to see applications that maybe the children aren't mature enough to see the application, but there's what the psalmist is saying here is there are some serious lessons for us to learn from these stories. They're not just stories. They're not just interesting. They're things we need to know and understand in order to properly apply these the lessons that are here. Okay? Other comments? Terry?
Gives our children the basis for understanding who God is. And you don't serve somebody you don't know about. You're not willing to submit to somebody that you don't see any power in or any authority in. And those things are so important to be taught even while someone is very small.
Right, so the lessons that he's teaching are, on the one hand, they teach us about God, who God is. And we talked many times about the importance of knowing God, not just in things about him, but knowing what he's like and how we relate to him. We also learn lessons about our responsibilities, what kind of things we should do, and what happens if we do and what happens if we don't. And so these lessons are lessons of particular application to us too. Don't just think these are old stories. These have application to us today. Other comments? Rick?
I always like to think of Timothy, how he was raised from his grandma and his mother, and taught from a young age. And as he grew in God's Word.
Okay. And the responsibility we have to make sure our children know so they can teach their children. God revealed it beginning at Mount Sinai, but he intended for us to spread it. And especially our responsibility is to our own children and them to their children. That was his intent from the beginning of his relationship with people. It's not just your relationship with God, it's your children's relationship and their children's relationship. And a lot depends on you and me, how well they know that. Okay? Other comments? Let me ask one more question. What do we learn from this then about the importance of history? Of the Bible as a book of history? What can we learn about the importance of history here? Rick?
Well, you look at the Old Testament, and that is our learning ground for the New Testament, to look back on the Old Testament and see what God did for them, and the many, many great things he did for them, and realize his power, realize his mercy, and realize his grace.
Okay. Sharon?
It was kind of basic, but we learned that it's true. A lot of people look back at a lot of stories and say, well, it's just intended to be a fable or something like that, but if it were a fable, we wouldn't actually be learning about God. We only learn God's true qualities if we're studying true stories that show that. I'm not saying we can't learn it any other way, but if the Bible isn't true and trustworthy, then we're not going to trust God.
Okay. Velma?
Quite a few years ago, I was talking to an elderly aunt, not here, but in another city, and we were talking about these things, and I asked her if she would like to attend the meeting that they were having there in that city, at the church there. And she said, well, I went there once, but she said all they did was talk about the old stories in the Old Testament. And she said, I learned them all as a little child. She said, I don't see any use for that. So she completely missed the reason for knowing these stories of the Old Testament.
Okay. And even when you get to the New Testament, you have Stephen in his defense before the Sanhedrin Council in the book of Acts, and Paul teaching in Antioch of Pisidia. They go back and talk about these stories too. There's a reason for this. It's not just facts. It's not just some information about some things that happen. There's important lessons. And if the Bible, back to Sharon's point, if the Bible isn't true history, why should we believe any of it? The plan of God was revealed through history, and the scriptures are based in history, true factual events. Unlike Buddhism and Hinduism and those kinds of things, which is myths and legends, we have real history. And that's essential for us to believe if we're going to accept who God is and what our responsibility to him is. And to me, that's the very starting point of this psalm, emphasizes our need to know God and his relationship with people. And we'll see applications as we go. Anything else to verse 8? Scott, right?
So, in general, we don't know what tomorrow holds, but when we look backwards, we can see what people in their arrogance did by making bad choices. And so we can learn from their bad choices and not make the same choices that lead to the same destructive ends that they did.
Right, right. Okay? Let's move on then. Question number 4, verses 9 through 11. He criticizes Ephraim. And what's the criticism? Verses 9 through 11. What's God's criticism of Ephraim? Verses 9 through 11. Karen?
They did not keep the covenant of God, and they refused to walk in his law.
All right, didn't keep God's covenant, didn't walk in his law. Verse 10. Other comments on why he criticizes Ephraim? Bill?
They forgot his works and his wonders that he had shown them.
All right, think about that one. They forgot his works. They forgot the wonders. They forgot about these stories, this history that we're going to talk about. Not that they didn't necessarily know it, but they didn't see the significance of it. They failed to appreciate the importance of it. Okay? What else did he say about them? Anything else? Rick?
They turned back at the day of battle.
Day of battle, they turned back. Okay. So, observations, comments? Anybody? On what he's talking about here? Terry?
Well, it talks about we learn to put our confidence in God because of studying what he has done. And it appeared that Ephraim had forgotten what God would do for his people when they obeyed him. And so they didn't have the courage or see any need to go to battle.
Okay. So these lessons that we're talking about, they didn't appreciate. That was the problem. They didn't appreciate these lessons that we're talking about, and as a result, they failed in the time of opposition. Okay? First of all, just an observation of what does Ephraim refer to? Who is Ephraim? And why is he talking about Ephraim here? Did you think about that as you studied it? Sharon?
Ephraim was one of Joseph's sons and thus one of the tribes, but they're often used as symbolic of especially the northern kingdom, but often, sometimes of Israel, the Israelite nation as a whole.
Okay, so we talked about that in our Minor Prophet study, didn't we? That sometimes God will refer to one tribe, but they represent the whole nation, or refer to one city, or some cities, they refer to a whole area. And so he's not talking just about this particular tribe. The application was in general that God's people at times, the nation had failed to stand up for what was right. And so their spirit was not faithful before God. So he called them stubborn and rebellious. Didn't keep his commandments. Verse 8. Okay? Other comments on verses 9 through 11. Sharon?
Would I be correct that verse 9 is one of the few places that's actually symbolic here, that he's not so much referring to a particular battle that Israel wouldn't go on, but that because they forgot and so didn't obey God, they were as useless as an army that knows what they're supposed to do and has all their weapons, but the day they're actually supposed to fight, they turn back.
Okay, comments on that? Is this a specific battle, or is this just in general that they didn't stand for God as they should have? Anybody thought about that point? If it was a specific battle, what might it have referred to? When was the time when the people were expected to go to war and wouldn't? Terry?
They first went to Canaan.
Okay, that's what I thought of. When they first entered, or were supposed to enter the land of Canaan under Moses' leadership, and they wouldn't. So it may be that, or it may be general. Either way. Other comments? All right, let's move on then to question number 5 then, verses 12 through 16. What had God done for the people in verses 12 through 16? And we'll look at some scriptures. What had he done for the people in 12 through 16? Karen?
He had done marvelous things, including dividing the sea and causing them to pass through.
Okay. Especially talking about the passing through the Red Sea. Made the water stand up in a heap, verse 13. Okay. Did marvels. Even before that, he did marvels in the land of Egypt. Okay. We no doubt refer to the 10 plagues. What else in verses 14 through 16? What else did he do? Bill?
He gave them water to drink.
Water to drink from the rock. Steve, what were you going to say?
And he led them at night. He gave them light at night.
Okay. He led them at night with fire, the pillar of fire, in the daytime by the pillar of cloud. Okay. Was that what you were going to say, Steve, or did you have something else? Okay. Okay, so first of all, you've got the plagues in Egypt, the miracles and wonders there. Then the crossing through the Red Sea, verse 13. Leading them with the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, verse 14. And then the water from the rock, verse 15 and 16. And so I asked you for some scriptures that talk about these events. So, but you have the passages where some of these things are talked about. Neil.
Dividing the Red Sea is Exodus 14, verses 15 and 16.
Okay, Exodus 14, you've got the passing through the Red Sea. Others? Karen?
Exodus 7 to 12 are the marvelous things he did in the land of Egypt.
Okay, so you got the plagues, Exodus 7 through 12. Steve?
Providing water from the rock in Exodus 17 and 6 and Numbers 20 and 11.
Okay, so you have more than one reference to that, don't you? Okay. Other comments on verses 12 through 16 and the events there? Jeff, you have a comment for us?
Throw something out and let you comment on it. Based on 1 Corinthians 10, when Paul talks about the rock that followed them and the rock was Christ, I've heard the idea suggested that there was one rock that moved with them. It was the same rock in Exodus 17, the same rock again in Numbers 20, and so on. And yet I noticed that in this passage in verse 15 it says he split the rocks in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Would you conclude from that the idea that there was just one rock that literally moved through the wilderness with them is not what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 10, or is there something to that?
I'm not sure that I can answer the question, Jeff. I've always had the impression that it was different rocks, not one rock following them, literally following them. But that's just my offhand thinking. Any other comments on Jeff's question about whether it was one rock following them literally or whether there were different rocks at different times? Well, to me, the thing that impresses me is, think about, you had 600,000 men, not counting women and children. They're traveling through a wilderness where nobody lives there. And Moses, God through Moses, has to provide water for all those people every day, food every day for all those people. Imagine such a huge crowd, some people think it's a couple million people, traveling through the wilderness, and the responsibility to make sure they had enough food and water. That's why this is so presented as such a miracle, such an amazing thing that God would do this. I think we need to appreciate, from the standpoint of God, what he did here, but also from the standpoint of the people, the challenge of, if you were one of those people going day by day, where are we going to get our food? Where are we going to get our water? Who's going to provide for us as we do this travel? And it's easy for me, at least, to look back and think, well, why are they so critical? Why are they so complaining? Why are they having such a hard time with this? But think about what they were facing. I think it helps us to understand why, not to excuse them, but why they were tempted, at least, to not appreciate what God was doing for them. Other comments through 18? Or did you see that how far we went? 16. Other comments through 16? Okay. And then question number 6. Here's what God has done. All these good things he did, 17 through 20, how did the people respond? Question number 6, how did the people respond? God's done all these good things for them. He's led them, did the miracles, led them out of Egypt, from slavery, passed through the Red Sea, food, water, as the wilderness, and how they respond, verses 17 through 20. What they do? Rick?
They even sinned more, and they rebelled against him, and they tested God, spoke against him, and then they questioned him.
Okay. So rather than being obedient and appreciating what he did, they sinned even more, rebelled, tested him, and what did they want? They said, okay, well, we got water here. What did they want, Bill?
They were still asking for food.
Okay. They still wanted more food. In particular,
And they were still speaking against God.
okay. And that's part of when you read the accounts. They said, well, did God send us out here to kill us? And we'd been better off back in Egypt. Such thorough lack of appreciation for what God had done for them. And so now they wanted, not just, well, they said, okay, verse 20, okay, well, they gave us water, that's good, but what about food? Well, we'll see what he did about the food as we continue in the reading. Questions, discussion through verse 20. Terry.
I think when we look at this, people are the same today. We've been very highly blessed in this country and have so much that God has given us physically beyond what he has provided with his word about salvation and everything. But you hear people all around you and complaining, why isn't God taking care of this? Why hasn't God done that for me? How did God let this happen to me? Well, that's the same thing. We don't trust him to be looking out for our good. We don't follow him. We're sinning against him and speaking against him. And yet we disregard all that he has done, including sending his son. We know he sent his son now. We even know more than they did. And we act in the same way.
We've got all these stories from the Old Testament. Not just that, we've got the fulfillment in the New Testament. And yet it's easy for us to forget. He says they forgot. Not that we don't know. We don't appreciate the significance. We don't recognize what it means that we need to be faithful and obedient instead of complaining. Okay? Other comments through 20? Frank, and then we'll move on.
I think one of the greatest blessings we have is that we have his written word, so every one of us have several copies. It's so easy to have, to know God's will.
And again, do we appreciate that? back to Terry's point, do we appreciate what God has done for us and what we have, or do we just feel sorry for ourselves, like the Israelites did, that things aren't easier, that it's as hard as it is? I think we all deal with that. I do, that's for sure. Let's read 21 through 37. Who'd like to read verses 21 through 37 for us, please? Steve, verses 21 through 37, please.
Therefore the Lord heard this and was furious. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. Yet he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven, and rained down manna on them to eat, and given them of the bread of heaven. Men ate angels' food. He sent them food to the poor. He caused an east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought in the south wind. He also rained meat on them like the dust, feathered fowl like the sand of the seas, and he let them fall in the midst of their camp and around their dwellings. So they ate and were filled, and he gave them their desire. They were not deprived of their craving, but while their food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came against them, and slew the stoutest of them, and struck down the choice men of Israel. In spite of this, they still sinned, and did not believe in his wondrous works. Therefore their days he consumed in futility, and their years in fear. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and sought earnestly for God. Then they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High God their Redeemer. Nevertheless, they flattered him with their mouth, they lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful in his covenant.
All right, so we continue then with the history of God's dealings with the people, things that he'd done for them and how they'd responded. So we were discussing in verses before 20, the food. All right, he gave them water, but they wanted food. And not just any food, but they wanted particular kinds of food. So we'll see how God responds in verses 21. So question number 7 then, verses 21 through 25. How did the people conduct of the people compare to God's conduct? We saw what the people did. What did God do in response? Verse 21 through 25. How did God respond to the people? Frank?
Well, God was furious with them for their continual complaining, and it says that they did not trust in his salvation. And even though they didn't trust in his salvation, and he was furious with their complaining, yet he gave them manna to eat, gave them the food that they wanted.
Okay. So first of all, he was upset. He was angry. And notice he says they didn't believe in God, didn't trust in his salvation. In what way was their conduct an expression of a lack of faith? Why would he call this a lack of faith? We would say, well, they disobeyed. But why was it a lack of faith? Verse 22. Jason, is your hand up, or are you? Oh, I'm sorry. Sharon.
I've got another question after this one, so.
Okay, Sharon.
He's going to say that again in verse 32, that they sinned and did not believe. It's not that, when you look at the verbs that the whole psalm uses about what they were doing, they're rebelling, they're not believing, they're sinning, they're not believing. It's not that they didn't have any idea who God was, not that kind of not believing, but that they didn't believe him enough to actually trust him and do what he says. They're not believing enough to obey, and they're not believing enough to ask instead of complaining and just giving up.
So when we don't do what God says, oftentimes God views it as a heart problem. It isn't just the outward failure to do what was right. It's the fact that if we believed like we should, if we had the proper faith that we should, we would do what was right. And so many times our disobedience reflects our attitude problems. And we don't trust God and have faith in him like we should. If they had the faith they should have, they would have trusted him. Look at all the great things he's done. Look at all the miracles he's done. Surely he's going to take care of us now. Why should we doubt him? Daryl?
On this thought that they did not believe, I believe it's John 6. Jesus feeds the multitude and they follow him, and Jesus says, "You do not believe." The day before they wanted to make him king. Sounds like they believe, but they didn't really believe the message that he had for them. And interestingly, as I was thinking about this just now, both of them revolved around food.
Around manna in particular.
Israelites.
Yeah.
Not satisfied with the food God was giving them. They wanted all this other kind of food. The people following Jesus wanted Jesus to do another miracle and give them food. It's just an interesting parallel.
Right. Jason, you said you had a question?
Well, it mentioned two different people in 21. Fire was kindled against Jacob, who was the leading presence in Egypt. He was there. He set the story for his brothers to come in when there was famine in the land. He took care of them. So there's food there. And then anger also come up against Israel. Now, why did he mention two different people there like that?
Okay. So he's got two different names in verse 21. You've got Jacob, you've got Israel. First of all, who is Jacob, who is Israel? Same person. Different names for the same person. Why are they both named? We have an example of parallelism. That's what we've been talking about again and again in these in the Hebrew poetry. The same thing is said in different ways, and I think that's the answer, Jason. That's just the same thing, just being said different ways. But while we're there about the fire kindled, that was interesting to me. When was fire kindled against Jacob when they were asking for food? Did you think about that one? I wondered about that one. The fire was kindled when they were asking for food. Anybody pursue that, Terry?
Some of them were killed before the meat was sent into because of their complaining. It says that God killed some.
Yes, and not only does it say that, but what I found was in Numbers chapter 11, there was literal fire sent. The first three verses, he sent a literal fire at first, and then later they were slain with other ways, but they didn't just, God wasn't just upset with them, there were consequences. Okay, did I see other hands? Okay, so anyway, we've got now the lack of faith in God, and we're ready to question number 8, the application. So we've discussed the problem of people wanting things their way instead of God's way. What are some examples of that kind of thing today? Terry's already brought us into that idea, but what can be some examples of people today who, here's what God says, but they're not satisfied, they want their way? Steve?
Accumulating wealth and possessions instead of helping those in need.
Okay. Using what we have for ourselves, rather than being willing to use it the way God says we should use it. God has a purpose in giving us wealth, and it's not just that we can enjoy it. Certainly it's not wrong to have some things in this world, but so often we neglect what God wanted us primarily to use them for in his service and helping others and so on. Okay, other examples? Where we use things for ourselves instead of the way God wants us to, Karen?
Well, it's certainly one reason we have all the denominations, because people want to worship God in their own way, instead of believing in the church that Christ purchased with his own blood.
Okay, so we can go on and on with that one, can't we? Why all these different churches? Why all these different ways of worship? Why all these different ideas about salvation? Why is it? Because people aren't satisfied with God's way. They don't believe. They don't trust God that what he says is that's the way it should be. We'll just do it that way and let it go at that. Okay? So, again, the stories have application to us today. Okay? Other examples or other discussion you want through verse 25? Anybody? Rick?
We just place earthly things and our own self-pride above spiritual commandments for our own pleasure. It's 2 Timothy chapter 4 is one I really come up with. They talk about people want to hear what they want to hear and follow somebody that's teaching what they want to hear.
And preachers that will tickle their ears. Sharon, do you have a comment?
We pretty much, our country has, by and large, gotten rid of the whole roles that God has given people toward each other. Wives don't want to be in subjection to their husbands. They want to be equal. We want to think it doesn't even matter which gender we are. We can change it. We just will be what we want to be and live the way we want to live instead of treating each other with the roles God gave us.
Look at the world. There's the answer to why, or to examples of people doing things the way they want instead of what God says. Just look at what's going on around us. Much of it is exactly that very kind of thing. And it's easy for us to look back and criticize the people of Israel. But we face similar temptations, and it's all around us, and we have to recognize our responsibility to just do what God says. If you believe what he says, you do what he says. Okay? So he's given them manna to eat through verse 25. Questions, comments before we move on? Okay, so then question number, second question number 8, which is really question number 9. How did God respond to their demands then? So they said, okay, we want food and we want manna, but the food you've given us isn't good enough. We want a different kind of food. So verse 26 to 31, how did God respond to that? Their demand for a different kind of food. They wanted meat. What did God do? Terry?
He gives them what they ask for, and then they die because of the way they use it. Because they become so greedy with him. And they can't trust him to take care of them again tomorrow, so they have to gather all they can today, and they die even while they're eating it.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, so he gave what they asked for, but he punished them for it. Okay. Verse 26, he brought east wind and wind from the south, rain to meat. Other passages say it's quail, feathered fowl. And he let them fall in the camp, verse 28. So they ate, they were filled. He gave them their desire. But while the food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came against them and slew the stoutest of them. Many of them died. Okay? So God gave what they asked for, but he gave something more, and that wasn't what they wanted. Okay? Other comments on the problem with the food? Through verse 31. Okay? So now question number 10, how do people respond to that? Here God has done all these great things for them, and he'll do something great for them, and they complain. He does something else great, and they complain. He does something else great, they complain. So now he's given them the food that they wanted, and how did they respond in verse 32? How was their reaction to that? Frank?
They continued in sin. Then when he slew them, then they turned and sought after God and remembered that he is their Redeemer, but they still weren't true to him. They tried to flatter God, yet they lied and were not steadfast, nor were they faithful to his covenant.
Okay. So they didn't believe, verse 32, there's this lack of faith again. And when he slew them, verse 34, then they sought him. They returned and they sought diligently for God. They remembered God was their rock. The Most High, their Redeemer. Sound like this is great. Okay, they got it straightened out. They're going to do what's right. But it was flattery. They flattered him with their mouth, lied with their tongue. Their heart was not steadfast. They were not faithful to his covenant. In what sense was their reaction what would the scripture calls flattery? How is that flattery? How would he call that flattery? What is flattery?
False praise.
Okay, false praise. Saying what people want to hear, though you don't mean it. Okay. So they said what, or acted like they were wanting to serve God. They remembered who he was, and now they want to serve him, but they didn't mean it. Again, there was a heart problem. It wasn't right in their attitude. They flattered with their mouth, lied with their tongue, but their heart wasn't steadfast. They weren't faithful in his covenant. So here again we have a problem. Yes, God has blessed them, but they respond with a lack of true commitment, a lack of true willingness to please him. Okay? So now for next week, we're going to go, Lord willing, through the rest of the chapter, and we'll see the same pattern. God is good, the people respond with disobedience. God is good, the people respond with disobedience. As we'll see through the rest of the chapter. Questions or comments before we close? Okay, thank you for your participation.